Pentru mare parte din lumea democratică, victoria lui Erdogan la alegerile din Turcia a venit ca o surpriză. Pentru cei care cunosc bine regiunea, era așteptată. Tendința de a vedea lumea conform propriilor dorințe se dovedește a fi greșită, pentru că nu se suprapune cu realitatea și așa apare mirarea. Nu discutăm despre bine și rău, ci doar despre nuanțele pe care le are fiecare stat în parte. Kass a lucrat mai bine de 30 de ani pentru Departamentul de Stat, cunoaște foarte bine Turcia și am discutat împreună despre lumea văzută dintr-o singură perspectivă. Sunt Cristina Cileacu. Începe Pașaport Diplomatic. Kass, former US diplomat, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Cristina. Honor.
Your expertise is in Turkey, so we saw recently that Recep Erdogan remained president of his country,
yeah.
But his country has a lot of problems in both domestic and foreign as well to solve. Who will help Erdogan?
It's always important to start out with a view about where we stand with respect to Turkey. And I think that has to start with the acknowledgement that President Recep Erdogan is a phenomenon in Turkish history, in Turkish politics. It wasn't too long ago that people were counting him out completely, and as I remember saying in April, that I thought he was actually in a pretty good position to win, even while the polls were showing that he wasn't. And of course he came and won in the second round after becoming very close in the first round. And he did that even in the face of severe economic challenges and with the earthquake, the devastating earthquake, 50,000 people dead. But what this election demonstrated was that despite the challenges, overall the Turkish people looked at him as a man who knew what he was doing. And the reason why they did that and why he was able to win was because he understood what they want. And if you look back over his career, you'll see why. I mean, he started coming to power in 2003, early 2003, as prime minister after his AKP won the election in 2002, was immediately confronted by a very aggressive secularist, Kemalist state, one that had just staged a coup d'etat, which had kicked him out of politics back in the 90s. The term deep state actually comes from Turkish parlance, and he was able to survive, battle, push back, and eventually ensure that elected civilians were going to be running the country. And the reason why he was able to do that, I think, was because he was very much in tune with what actual Turkish citizens were all about, not some sort of abstract construct that so many Westerners, Western media and others, would apply to Turkey in the interest of shaping Turkey in a way that suited their ideological predilection. In summary, in this respect, I think that President Erdogan's victory should be a moment that causes some reflection and reconsideration, and particularly in the West, this is an opportunity to reconsider and to try to become more constructive in our relationship with Turkey, and that's Turkey. And that is to accept certain realities and to try to find ways to work with them as opposed to shunning them. We're seeing the importance of Turkey, for example, in the Ukraine war, where its relationship with both the Ukrainian side, with the Russian side, has been very, very interesting, and I suspect could be potentially very significant.
Well, before we step into Turkey and United States relationship, which is quite complicated, what's your take on the fact that Erdogan wants to impose a more conservative country and that is an opposition to the Kemalist Republic that, by the way, will be 100 years in October?
Well, I think that first, what has happened is I think that the AKP side has been able to reclaim Ghazi Mustafa Kemal from the clutches of the Kemalist ideological edifice that actually obviously began to develop with him, but was really taken to its heights under the CHP. And that was one of the problems that the main opposition CHP party had, was that it was saddled with this, still with the legacy of that old, rather troubling ideology. I think what President Erdogan has done has been to actually connect with the actual aspirations of like I like to say, actually existing Turkish people who tend to be more conservative.
But it looks like if we look at the elections that there are two sides of Turkey, those who are Kemalists, so it's almost half of the country, and the other that prefer Erdogan. So
but even the side who voted against Erdogan was not necessarily Kemalist. As a matter of fact, one of the biggest contributors were a nationalist party that was a splinter from the MHP. So in other words, Turkish nationalism on both sides. You have a Kemalist party, which is itself very nationalist. I mean, Kılıçdaroğlu may have represented the social democratic wing of that, let's say, but the base of it was still a very secular Kemalist nationalist point of view. And then you had a Kurdish party masquerading as a left party and adopting, I think, to its detriment, leftist political ideological discourse for a Kurdish constituency that is increasingly very, very pro-Kurdish, and yet also is very conservative in many ways. But what I'm trying to get at is that what you see generally is a society that, for the most part, tends towards more conservative values in their personal lives. Even the HDP constituency is Kurds, and Kurds, if anything, tend to be among the most conservative elements in Turkish society. Very much influenced by the traditional Sufi orders. As a matter of fact, many cases dominate those orders, and those orders have certain relevance and resonance throughout the society. On the other hand, you have a continuity angle on both sides, which is why what I thought was that if indeed somehow the opposition were to win, you would more or less see some continuity, or mostly a continuous sort of development along the lines that have already been provided by Erdogan, because he has really transformed the state from this Kemalist apparatus that was very hostile to any expressions of religion. It's not to say that Turkey has then become a liberal state, but what it has done undeniably is opened up the society to different voices, and many of those voices are just normal people in Turkey, normal Kurdish people in Turkey, who prefer a government that follows a conservative point of view on social issues.
Will we see a religion inside at the level of the institution of Turkey secular still?
I think it will still be a secular, but it won't be ideologically secularist. And I think that's the big difference. I mean, we're seeing some of that underway in the United States, where what was once a secular habit, a way of thinking about the world, has now become an ideological position which requires people to promote it and defend it and to impose it. So that's part of the American debate, which I think is really fascinating. I suspect it will always be secular in that sense, because I mean, Turkish tradition has been that way. I mean, there obviously, even during the Ottoman Empire, Islam played a very, very important role, but the jurisdiction of the Sultan was a very practical jurisdiction. He could do what he wanted to based on the interests of the Ottoman state. And I think Erdogan, in some respects, follows that model. In many respects, actually. And that's probably an appropriate thing, because you are able to connect as one must, I think, with the past of your country in ways that actually help build a future. Now, everybody mythologizes a little bit about what was good and what is bad. We do that in the United States, in Romania, everywhere. We mythologize a little bit about our history. But the point is that the connecting people to their past provides a framework and a direction to where they will go in the future that I think is probably essential in the interest of stability, if you want to instrumentalize it that way. So I think he's been able to do that like nobody else in Turkey. I mean, I don't think even under the olden days in Turkey they were able to do that without some sleight of hand. He's been rather open about his views and what he feels. I mean, he's a very practical politician, but a very devout Muslim. There's no disagreement or clash between those two sides. They're part of the same coin, can be. I think you're going to see a Turkey that continues to connect to its past, one that is increasingly assertive about its own interests, and I think that will be colorized in many respects by the changing international environment. So we're going from a unipolar moment to a multipolar world, and everybody in the world is trying to see how that's going to affect them. Almost everybody. I mean, outside of certain areas in Europe, most of the rest of the world is looking at this new situation to see where I'm going to go. You're seeing it in Southern Europe, you're seeing it in South Asia, you're seeing it obviously in Turkey, and I expect that Turkey will continue along that path regardless of what political movement or leadership comes after Erdogan eventually retires. He set the framework for this. Yeah.
And what about the relationship with the United States? We discussed before the interview that it's way too complicated and it's not at its best for a couple of years now. But Erdogan needs money, and there is this saying that if you need money, you go to Washington. Will he make this step towards Washington to improve the relationship?
Well, I think that he's trying to demonstrate, although I wouldn't put it in terms of Washington. I think it's more in terms of just the logic of the situation. It's very interesting that some of the cabinet members that he's chosen, and the first among those would be, in this respect, Mehmet Şimşek, who is a Kurdish origin and is well regarded internationally. I think he's a very, very smart man. You have Hakan Fidan, who's also Kurdish, who's coming over from the intelligence world, and another very, very smart guy. You have Minister Bayraktar, the new energy minister, again, very, very insightful, very smart, a lot of private sector experience. And Ibrahim Kalın, the spokesman, who is now the head of MİT, the head of the intelligence world, and really an intellectual and a very good musician, by the way. He plays the saz, which is kind of the equivalent of the kabza here, which I really love, by the way. So I think that what you see there is a very, very sophisticated group of people, which reflects Erdogan's understanding about the nature of the situation. Specifically with regard to the United States and the West generally, I have to say that when you think about how people understand things and perceive things, one of the great things that distresses me is the difficulty that people have had, which is reflected in the election turnout, the election effect, and from the West, and trying to actually understand the actual situation and the phenomenon on the ground that they're trying to sort of analyze. They shouldn't be analyzing in terms of Western ideological precepts. They should look at what's actually happening on the ground in Turkey, then build up from there, and then they can say, oh, this is where we might be able to work. So the media had not been very edifying, and I've said this before. It's been, it's kind of disappointing. There are some people in the media who are very good, who can give you a complete and full picture, but generally the general stuff that's being fed out is extraordinarily weak, and as a result of that, I think a lot of policy is made ideologically without fully understanding the dynamics. For example, in the United States, one of the things that I would point out would be that for the second time now, maybe the third time, during President Erdogan's inauguration speech, sitting at his left was Bartholomeus, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. As a Greek Orthodox, obviously my patriarch, and he's the first among equals in the Orthodox world and all of this. And I suspect that again, reflects not only Erdogan's own understanding of what the state should be doing, and drawing on the tradition of Turkey, but also perhaps should be understood in that context as something that can provide the constructive basis upon which to have a real relationship about these issues. So I think that maybe shedding some of the preconceptions or notions that that had dominated people for too long, with respect to Turkey, that people should begin looking with some fresh eyes. I know that's institutionally difficult because a lot of people have invested in a particularly hostile point of view. It's a real state with real challenges and real interests of its own. But you have to think realistically about, again, the phenomenon you're dealing with. And so I hope that this moment, this election, provides an opportunity for people all over the world to do some thinking about that, because I think it's in the interest of regional stability, particularly when you're thinking now. And I actually would have to commend Romania, because I think it has a pretty strategic view of the relationship with Turkey. And again, I think it speaks well to their sort of thinking about how the regional political situation should be working.
Speaking about the regional stability, of course, we do have a war in our region for over a year now. Romania is helping Ukraine, although there are no public talks about this help, but then again, Ukraine is not complaining.
Right.
On the contrary, so perhaps we do something good for them.
Well, definitely.
Considering that nobody knows when the war will ever stop, do you think the rest of us will manage to remain stable if the war prolongs?
Well, I think this is the big question, and I think it's very well considered. First of all, I would say that my understanding is that Romania is contributing positively to this, although not as in a showy way. I think the important thing is to consider two things. One, the interests of NATO and the NATO members, the actual NATO members, should be paramount in this situation, in my view. And I think that's the case. In that respect, the way to preserve NATO, which is a rather diverse collection of countries and becoming more diverse as we consider other members, the way to conserve that is to, at first, do no harm and to avoid putting undue pressure on an apparatus that's almost certain to exemplify or to exacerbate centrifugal tensions, right? We don't want that. I think that in that context, my view is that the Ukraine war needs to be brought to a ceasefire as quickly as possible, because the longer it goes, the worse it potentially gets. And we just saw what happened with the dam down in Kherson, yes, and obviously in the wake of the Bakhmut situation. As a strategic matter, what we don't want is to keep this war going to the point where people are getting killed and the result is the same. So I think that to the extent this thing can be ended on a humanitarian basis, at least a ceasefire, and then let's start to consider where we are. And that's difficult for a couple of reasons, I suspect. One of which is that it requires people to think realistically about where the situation is, and it's not an appetizing thing because the Russians invaded. And but we're in this situation, and now the question is, what do you do now when you're here? There's some utility to begin thinking about how to, if the term is frozen conflict or what. I mean, it's not ideal, but it might be better than some of the alternatives, and so I suspect that people will be thinking about that. But regardless of what happens in Ukraine, the important thing is, again, strengthening and shoring up the relationships between the United States and NATO countries, particularly the NATO countries in this eastern corridor, which runs, in my opinion, from Greece all the way up to the Baltics. And this is like the new wall, which will help limit further penetration. I would also say that in that context, that one of the things you need is economic development, because the Russians have been very skillful over years and years and decades about finding ways to penetrate into societies using financial means, shall we say. And so to the extent that there are strong economic ties to the United States, we can do much more. And I think that's actually where the United States has a real strong hand. We're good at, we have a lot of commercial know-how, we're good at that.
Behind you in your frame is the portrait of former President Trump, who is running again for the presidency of the United States. He also said that if he becomes president, perhaps the war will be quicker ended, and also the help for Ukraine will not be needed anymore. Do you think this could actually happen?
Well, first of all, if you look completely down the row here, you see pictures of Presidents Obama and Bush. But yes, I was honored to work with President Trump as well, and we learned a lot. All of these gentlemen are actually quite impressive in their way, and I really enjoyed working with President Trump at the end in particular. I think that he has a realistic sort of understanding of what's going on. I think this comment is actually one that reflects that realism. And it also reflects, I think, where the debate is in the United States. Now, the establishments of both the Republican and Democratic Party, I think, are still solidly behind the status quo position, but there is some modification being introduced into the debate by what seem to be public attitudes on both the left and right. So that's a reality. That's something that I think it behooves everyone to sort of pay attention to. What the modalities of that or how it will be expressed, I suspect that it obviously will have an impact, but it's not just the idea of what you want to do, it's how you have to do it based on the situation that you're in. We've seen, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, the idea of withdrawing from Afghanistan was popular. The method by which that was accomplished was not very successful, and of course that had implications. So I think it's one thing to have the idea, and then the question becomes, once that is implemented, how do you do it? And you're seeing, candidate DeSantis sounding similarly. I think he doesn't have as much experience on foreign policy. The Democrats seem to be more or less united on under the current Biden administration's view, although there's a lot of ferment in the electorate. So we'll just have to see how it plays out, but it's pretty early before the elections. But obviously we'll have some significance when we start to see how it shapes up.
Nicholas Kass, thank you so much for
Thank you very much,
discussion.
Cristina. Appreciate it.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!